What is up, Pitt fans? Thank you so much for tuning in to Inside the Panthers on YouTube. My name is Stephen Thompson, coming at you with another Inside Pitt practice report after the seventh practice of the spring for the Pitt Panthers. It was a wet one, and it was a spirited one. The Panthers needed it, according to head coach Pat Narduzzi. They had a little bit of a lax attitude after a spring scrimmage at Acrisure Stadium, their first of the year in the cold and rain and wet conditions. It was not a particularly fun day to be out there, but Pat Narduzzi said that his players came back with some energy today, and by the looks of it, they really needed it because there were a few, especially on the offensive side of the ball, because there were a few extra takeaway stickers on the helmets of some of those some select defenders. The defense was wearing the blue uniforms today. That means they won the scrimmage over the weekend. As Pat Narduzzi will tell you, it comes down to turnovers mostly in these intra squad scrimmages. If you don't turn the ball over as an offense, you're going to win most of the time, and if you are a defense that is turning the ball over on the other side of things, you are most likely going to win. It seems like the latter happened. The defense was able to turn over the offense quite a bit. Maybe some ball security issues going on for the offense, and you could see them really start to get after it. It was a nice day to maybe try and redeem themselves. It was cold, it was wet, it was rainy at the UPMC Rooney Sports Complex on the south side. So the offense got a chance to jump back into it. They were in full pads one more time, or full pads once again. And it just seemed like it was a good opportunity for the Panthers to really redeem themselves a little bit as an offense. And you could see, at least during the open portion of practice, that Pat Narduzzi was really getting on them, especially the receivers. I saw him going after them. He saw them maybe going through a ball security drill a little bit laxer than he would have liked. But then he walks over and he's yelling at them to really try to rip that ball out, to really challenge their teammates. And when we spoke to him after practice, it sounded like they really needed kind of a kick in the rear end, that they needed to kind of get going. This offense needed some motivation, and they will certainly get some from Pat Narduzzi, who was all over them. And he wanted to challenge them quite a bit. He wasn't. He said there was no wiping of the balls off. There was no trying to make it a little bit drier. There was no going into the indoor facility. He was keeping them out there on the outdoor practice facilities, and he wanted them to embrace the elements. I think over the past few weeks, we've seen, or 2 weeks, I guess, of spring ball, we've seen them for the most part when there is even slightly inclement weather, when it was a little bit cold, when there was maybe some drizzle. The team would go inside. They would go into the indoor practice facility, which is very nice. It's a little smaller, so when you have a pretty decently sized spring roster that's pretty big, I believe it's damn near 100 players, if not at 100 players or north of that. So the outdoor space is pretty useful. You can use all of the extra field that you've got, whereas at the indoor facility you're a little bit more cramped. Today wasn't the case. Even as the rain started to pour down, and it started to come down pretty hard, especially at the beginning of practice, the Panthers stayed out there. They stayed working, and Pat Narduzzi clearly wanted them to embrace the elements. So we'll see later this week as we get one more practice to view, and then assume another scrimmage coming up at the end of the weekend or at the end of the week that we'll get to hear about the following week, and we'll see if the offense is able to redeem themselves in some live action. Speaking of those takeaway stickers, I noticed one on Cruz Brookins, still a freshman safety at Steel Valley High School, a Western PA guy, a whippy old guy. We have heard a ton about him, and watching him play just a little bit. You've seen some highlights, but we have heard a ton about Cruz Brookins, and I'm here to tell you that I really think he is the real deal. I like Cruz Brookins, and what strikes me the most is that he's pushing for playing time as a safety at a position where he really has no business pushing for playing time, or where the average player, I should say, wouldn't really have any business pushing for playing time. I mean, you've got three veterans, all considered starters that will rotate through and that you'd expect to play a bulk of the minutes. Is what they did last year. I thought Javon McIntyre, PJ O'Brien, and Donovan McMillan were three of the better players on that defense as a whole last season. And Cruz Brookins is on their heels, pushing for playing time, pushing to get them out of those spots and maybe take a few snaps away from them. Narduzzi told us today that we're going to see some of Cruz at nickel cornerback in that Delta package as that fifth DB, but we might just see him playing at safety. We don't know what injuries might happen, of course, but I think independent of that, Brookins is making it really hard for this coaching staff to take him off of the field. He's an aggressive hitter. He's athletic, and he's got good instincts. And it really struck me when, Pat Narduzzi, he likes to throw around the term football player, and it's not I say throw around, but it's a high compliment coming from him. You can tell he only says it about players that he thinks are really good and that he really sees great things in. He said it about Chris Brookins, and not only did he give him that football player label, but he explained it a little bit. He said, most guys, there's some guys who are good athletes, and you got to make them into football players. Brookins is not one of those guys. He is already a football player. He understands the game. He has instincts for it. He knows where to be on the field that are in ways that seem natural. He just has an understanding. He is hardwired for the game of football, and I think that's something coaches really appreciate and they marvel at because it means less coaching for them to a certain extent, but it also means that guys are a little bit ahead of the curve. That there is just something in them that understands football a little bit better than others do, and you can see just talking to Cruz last year around training camp, and then seeing him kind of up close and personal this year during spring ball, you can tell he got bigger, he got stronger, he is more confident, he plays with a lot of energy and a lot of swagger, which I think is always fun to watch, especially from a safety. He loves that boundary safety position that he's playing in right now. That's where he plays mostly. It's very similar to kind of the strong safety position that he played in high school, where he just gets to level people. He loves to hit, he loves the contact, and he loves the physicality. He says that's one of the biggest parts of his game. And I'm really just excited to see what this guy can do in a regular season game. If I could see into those scrimmages, I would love to watch him play a little bit. But told us he had a forced fumble in the scrimmage on Saturday, and we have heard nothing but good things about Cruz Brookins, who is rapidly rising up the depth chart and pushing for playing time in a really, really surprising way. The other notable thing about Brookins and about what he means to kind of the defense as a whole and what he means to kind of this team as a whole is just that his recruiting class, you start to look back on it and you go down the list of guys who joined in the same class as Brookins, and Brookins is kind of leading the way right now. He seems like one of those guys who is pushing the most for playing time right now. Obviously outside of Kenny Johnson, who is a starter right now, BJ Williams, who was a starter last year at times as well. But this freshman class, this 2023 recruiting class, starting to look kind of loaded. I mean, you can start at the top, and Jordan Bass was the highest rated recruit in that class. He's going to play a lot at linebacker this year. He played a lot last year. He was an excellent special teams player as well. You go down, Isaiah Neal, the next highest rated guy. He's going to see some time at defensive tackle this year. They're really excited about what he can bring, not just as a player, but as a leader as well. There's Brookins, who's the next highest rated player as well. I mentioned BJ Williams, a starter last year at guard, and he's listed as a tackle on his recruiting profile. So who knows what kind of upside he has if he gets back to a natural position. You got Johnson as well, who's a starter as well, and probably going to be a starter this season, almost certainly going to be a starter this year as well. You can pretty much put that one in Sharpie. But there's some other really interesting names in here. I mean, Jesse Anderson listed as a wide receiver on his recruiting profile, playing safety now and playing it really well by all accounts. Maybe needs to, fine tune his details a little bit, according to Narduzzi. But they love his energy, they love his athletic ability, they love his size, and they're excited about him as part of a really deep safety room. It's funny, Narduzzi made a comment during practice today where last year they didn't know what safety was going to look like. Now that they have, and now this year they feel like they have 5, 6 guys that they could play there at safety and feel pretty confident about. You got the 3 freshman receivers, the non-Kenny Johnsons, Israel Polk, Zion Fowler, and Lamar Seymour. We're going to get to them in a minute in a little bit more detail, but I think at least one of those guys is going to break out for some major playing time this year. Rasheem Biles is another linebacker that is making up that really deep and strong linebacking core that we talked about before. And Braylon Lovelace, again, was in that class as well. Tay Ray and Montravius Lloyd are kind of underrated guys that seem to be just kind of waiting their turn in loaded position groups. Lovelace, a linebacker as well. We're going to see a ton of playing time as well alongside, Biles and Bass and Brookins as well. Those are guys who are pushing for those 2 deeps. You just go down the list, and as these guys have progressed through their first year, you're starting to see a much more loaded recruiting class, one that maybe went a little bit underrated. It was ranked only 56th overall in the country. In the ACC, it wasn't particularly highly ranked either. This is at least according to 24/7 Sports. But it has the makings of a really strong class and one of those classes that you might be able to look back on in a few years and think, wow, there were so many stars and so many guys who really built Pitt up after, let's face it, a pretty lowly season in 2023. They or 2020, yeah, 2023. They took their lumps then, and hopefully it pays off in the long run. I told you we were going to talk about those three freshman receivers, but I want to talk about really the receivers room as a whole. Pat Narduzzi told us last week that they could play as many as six guys in this up-tempo offense, and they can have six receivers that they basically consider starters because they are going to rotate through snaps a ton and just so much to the point that there's not only three starters. There are basically two lines that they are going to have playing starter reps. It's pretty easy to figure out who those top three guys will be. The guys who are out there for the first snap. It will probably typically be Day Reynolds, Kanate Mumfield, and Kenny Johnson. I think that's a pretty safe bet. Those guys all started multiple games last year. They were all listed as starters on the depth chart. And you have to assume that since they're back, they will reprise that role. We've heard good things about Mumfield and Johnson in particular. I'm really high on Day Reynolds. I think he can be a good player in this offense as well. But past that, there's a bit of a competition. There's a lot of competition, in fact. I will say, first of all, we've heard some good things about Raphael Poppy Williams. Poppy Williams had a pretty good scrimmage, according to Narduzzi, over the weekend, made some impressive catches over the shoulder, adjusting to footballs, and scored a couple times as well. So I've heard some pretty good things about him throughout spring ball, and I'd kind of expect him to maybe claim one of those spots. He's a little bit on the smaller side, but he's got speed. He's got some twitch, and he's got some agility, helping him run routes that should help him. If this offense is what we think it is, and it thrives on getting people open, he can use his speed to make yards after the catch and make life a little bit easier on Nate Yarnell. I'm interested if there really are, two more quote unquote starting spots. I'm really interested to see who fills them. I think those three freshman receivers that I mentioned, Lamar Seymour, Zion Fowler, and uh, Israel Polk. Those are guys that we've heard about at different points throughout their first year at Pitt. If I was a betting man, I would say at least one of those guys fills one of those, kind of secondary spots, those second starter, that kind of second line alongside Williams. I'd be willing to, if I had to bet on one of them, I'd say it's Israel Polk. We've heard about that guy going back to last year. But I'll be honest, I think Zion Fowler is kind of an athletic freak. He just pops so much with his speed and his big play ability, his leaping ability, his ability to go high point the football. He's not terribly big, but you can see the explosive athleticism in him. It's like he's kind of wound tight like a rubber band, and he's just waiting to snap, as soon as you let him run free. And then Lamar Seymour just has burners, man. He's a speedster, and I wouldn't count either of those guys out either. But it seemed like the coaching staff at least thought last year that Polk was kind of the furthest along of those three. And then in that last spot, it really is anyone's game. I mean, one of those other freshmen who doesn't get that kind of second spot could get this third spot right here. Again, I'm not counting any of them out. But Jake McConaughey put on scholarship last year. He has played a little bit for the Panthers in spots to kind of overcome some injuries as well. He did in 2022. I think he's solid. I think he's a good blocker. I think, if he's a sixth receiver, even if you're playing him a bunch of snaps, he can be valuable, especially as a run blocker. I think he has decent hands. He's a veteran. He knows what he's doing. So I think he's a candidate as well. But I also think CJ Lee is a guy that another transfer like Williams from Western Carolina, a guy who knows this offense. Again, a little smaller, but has some speed and some agility, some twitch. And I think that's a guy that you can't really count out either. So I'm really interested to see how this wide receiver battle goes. I think it'll go down to the wire. And also, I think we're going to see so many guys rotate in and out. It's really going to be by committee, especially to start until they really start to separate. Guys start to get in better shape, and they feel like they have a better grip on who those top six or those top three, and probably eventually those top 4 or 5 that are really going to end up playing the vast majority of the snaps are. Appreciate you all tuning in to another Inside Pitt practice report. I'm going to head out of here, but appreciate you all tuning in. Like I said, make sure to like this video, subscribe to us on YouTube, youtube.com/@InsideThePanthers, and follow all of our reporting from spring ball and Pitt basketball's offseason at InsideThePanthers.com. Appreciate you all tuning in, and I will see you next time.